"Who are you calling, little girl?" Judge Henry Miller leaned forward from his massive mahogany bench, expecting a frightened child to lower the phone and run back to her family. Instead, the little girl in the pink dress looked up at him. She didn't blink. She didn't apologize. She simply tightened her grip on the black smartphone pressed against her ear. "Whoever I want," she said. For 1 second, nobody moved. Then Judge Miller laughed. Not a polite courtroom chuckle. Not the restrained smile of a respected judge. He threw his head back and laughed so loudly that several attorneys exchanged nervous glances. The bailiff looked at the ceiling. One lawyer covered his mouth. Even the man whose phone had just been stolen looked like he wasn't sure whether he was allowed to object. The little girl didn't care. She was about 4 years old, with blonde hair tied into 2 tiny pink pigtails. She stood in the middle of a courtroom designed to intimidate grown adults, holding a phone that didn't belong to her, apparently calling someone who did. Judge Miller wiped a tear from the corner of his eye. "All right, young lady," he said between laughs. "Call whoever you want." And that was the moment everything changed. Because someone answered. The laughter stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. The smile disappeared from Judge Miller's face. His hand froze halfway toward the bench. The courtroom became so quiet that everyone could hear the faint electronic crackle coming from the phone. Then a woman's voice came through. "Mia?" The judge's eyes widened. "Mia, honey, is that you?" Judge Henry Miller knew that voice. He had spent 2 years trying to forget it. His daughter, Isabella, a woman who had blocked his phone number, returned his letters, moved to another state, and told him she never wanted to speak to him again. Henry slowly stood. The little girl looked at him. "Mom," she said. The judge swallowed hard. "Mom?" "Mom." Mia nodded. Then she looked directly into the judge's eyes. "Mom, there's a man in a black robe." Henry's heart began pounding. He was laughing. She paused, then whispered into the phone, "He isn't laughing anymore." No one in that courtroom breathed, because Henry Miller suddenly understood something. This little girl wasn't a random child. She was his granddaughter. A granddaughter he had barely known. A granddaughter he had seen only a handful of times. A granddaughter standing in his courtroom because the family he had spent years judging had finally come back to judge him. And the worst part was that Henry had no idea why. Not yet. 2 years earlier, Isabella had stood inside her father's chambers with tears in her eyes. She was 31 years old, a pediatrician, a mother, and at that moment just a daughter begging her father for help. "Dad, Robert isn't following the custody agreement." Henry didn't look up. He continued reading the papers on his desk. "He's keeping Mia from me." Still nothing. "She's 3 years old." Henry finally removed his glasses. "Isabella, you know I can't interfere. You're my father. I am also a judge." She stared at him. The air conditioner struggled against the August heat. "I didn't come here asking you to break the law." Henry adjusted his glasses. "I have professional responsibilities." Isabella's voice trembled. "I'm asking you to care." That sentence should have stopped him. It didn't. She stepped closer. "Mia has been neglected. I told you to take this through the proper channels. She's your granddaughter." Henry's expression hardened. "Then you should be even more careful about following the law." Isabella stared at him for several seconds. Then something inside her broke. "Fine." She wiped her eyes. "You want to be a judge?" She nodded slowly. "Then be a judge." She walked out. Henry never realized that those would be the last words she would speak to him for 2 years. Half. At first, Henry assumed she would come back. She didn't. He sent messages. No response. He sent letters. They came back unopened. He asked relatives to intervene. They refused. Christmas came. Then her birthday. Then his. Silence. The silence became part of his life. He went to court every morning. He sat behind his elevated bench. He sentenced criminals, settled disputes, ruled on custody cases, signed orders, built an impressive reputation. People respected Judge Henry Miller. Some feared him. Some admired him. But nobody saw what happened after he returned home. The empty kitchen. The untouched dining table. the photographs he stopped looking at, and one photograph in particular, a little girl with blonde hair, Mia, his granddaughter. He had seen her only 3 times, once as a newborn, once during a tense family visit, and once from across the street. He had watched Isabella turn the stroller around the moment she saw him. That memory haunted him. But Henry had always been good at suppressing things. He had spent 23 years learning how to hide emotion behind a black robe, until the morning Mia walked into his courtroom. She had slipped away during a break in a custody hearing. Her grandmother, Elizabeth, had been sitting in the gallery. Mia noticed a man in an expensive suit standing nearby. Claude Foster, Robert's attorney. His phone was sticking halfway out of his coat pocket. Mia quietly reached over, took it, walked away, and nobody stopped her. She made her way toward the front of the courtroom. Then she dialed a number. Henry noticed her. At first he thought she was playing. Then he heard the ringing. "What are you doing down there?" "Calling, calling." "Calling who?" The girl looked at him as though he had asked the most ridiculous question imaginable. "Whoever I want." The courtroom erupted. Henry laughed. But now, staring at the little girl and hearing his daughter's voice through the phone, he couldn't remember what had been so funny. "Mia," Isabella whispered through the phone. "Yes, Mom." "Where are you?" "In a big room." Henry slowly lowered himself from the bench. "There is a man in a black robe." Mia looked at him. He was laughing. She paused. He stopped. He stopped. Henry's throat tightened. "Mia," he whispered. The girl looked up. "Are you Grandpa Henry?" The courtroom seemed to tilt. Henry had faced murder trials, corporate scandals, political corruption. He had stared down angry defendants and grieving families, but nothing prepared him for 4 words from a little girl. "Are you Grandpa Henry?" His lips parted. I am. His voice cracked. Mia nodded. Then she turned back toward the phone. "Mom. Mom." She smiled. "It's him." There was silence. Then Henry heard something he hadn't heard in years. His daughter's voice breaking. "I know." Mia held the phone toward him. "She wants to talk to you." Henry stepped down from the bench. One step, then another. For 23 years, everyone had stood beneath him. That morning he walked down to stand beside a 4-year-old girl. Then he knelt. His knees touched the courtroom floor. He took the phone. "Isabella." "Dad." One word. That's all she said. But Henry felt the weight of 20 years behind it. Why is Mia there? Silence. "Isabella, what's happening?" She breathed slowly. Then came the answer. "I'm sick. I'm sick." Henry's face changed. "What do you mean?" "I have cancer." His fingers tightened around the phone. "What kind?" "What kind?" "Stage 2 breast cancer." Henry couldn't speak. "I've been doing chemotherapy for 4 months." The courtroom disappeared. The judge disappeared. The reputation disappeared. There was only a father hearing his daughter tell him she'd been fighting cancer alone. "When were you going to tell me?" Isabella was quiet. Then she answered, "When you understood what mattered." Henry closed his eyes, because he remembered. 2 years earlier, the same words. Almost exactly. "You want me to care," she had said. And he had told her to follow the rules. Now she was sick, and his granddaughter was standing beside him. Henry looked at Mia. The little girl reached out and touched his black robe. "Grandpa?" He looked down. "Can you tell Mom to come home?" That sentence destroyed him. Henry turned toward the bailiff. "Stop the hearing." The attorneys looked shocked. "Your Honor." Everyone out? But everyone. Within minutes the courtroom emptied. The massive wooden doors closed. Henry remained on the floor. Mia stood beside him. He opened his arms. She hesitated, then walked into them. Henry held his granddaughter for the first time and cried. Not quietly, not professionally, not with dignity. He cried like a man who had spent decades holding everything inside and suddenly realized he had wasted too much time. Mia wrapped her tiny arms around his neck. "It's okay, Grandpa." Henry buried his face in her hair. "No," he whispered. "It isn't." That evening, Henry sat across from Elizabeth in her kitchen, his ex-wife, the woman he hadn't spoken to in years. Mia was asleep upstairs. Henry stared at a cup of coffee. "You knew." Elizabeth nodded. "She told you." "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." "She asked me not to." Henry looked up. "Why?" Elizabeth studied him. "Because Isabella wanted to know whether you would ever come looking for her." Henry looked away. "She wanted to know whether you cared enough to find out what was happening without being forced." The words hurt, because they were true. Henry looked down at his hands. Those hands had signed thousands of orders. They had changed people's lives, but they hadn't held his daughter in years. "I failed her." Elizabeth didn't soften the truth. "Yes." Henry nodded. "I failed Mia too." "Yes." Silence. Then Elizabeth added quietly, "But today you stepped down from the bench." Henry looked at her. "Maybe that's where you should have been all along." At 11 that night, Isabella called again. Henry answered. This time, he didn't defend himself. He didn't mention the law. He didn't talk about procedure. He didn't explain his career. He listened. For 3 hours, Isabella told him everything. The diagnosis, the chemotherapy, the fear, the exhaustion, the nights she couldn't sleep, the fear that Robert would use her illness to fight for full custody of Mia, and the anger she had carried toward her father. Finally, Henry spoke. "I was wrong." Isabella said nothing. "I thought my legacy was the law." His voice trembled. "I thought being respected was enough." Another silence. "I built a name in this city." He swallowed. "And I lost my family while I was doing it." Isabella finally whispered, "You always knew." Henry closed his eyes. "You knew what you were doing was hurting us." She paused. "You just thought your career was more important." Henry had no defense, because she was right. The next morning, Henry arrived at the courthouse before sunrise, but he didn't take his seat. He went directly to the clerk. He filed a formal recusal from every case involving Isabella or Robert. He would not use his position to help his daughter. He would not manipulate the system. He would not become the thing he had spent his career pretending he wasn't. For the first time, Henry understood the difference between justice and control. He stepped aside. The case went before another judge, and without Henry's influence, the evidence was finally examined objectively. Robert had a long history of broken agreements, unpaid debts, manipulation, and repeated attempts to use the legal system against Isabella. The new judge ruled in Isabella's favor. Robert received supervised visitation. Isabella retained primary custody. The law worked. But this time, Henry wasn't the one making the ruling. He simply allowed the truth to speak. Over the next few months, Henry changed. He visited Isabella during chemotherapy. The first visit was awkward. They barely knew how to talk anymore. But Mia didn't care. She pulled Henry into games. She made him draw dragons. She asked him impossible riddles. She demanded bedtime stories. And slowly the walls began to fall. On his third visit, Isabella laughed. Henry hadn't heard that laugh in years. They talked about her childhood, a camping trip, a broken bicycle, a ridiculous birthday cake Henry had once tried to make. For a few minutes, there was no cancer, no custody battle, no courtroom. Just a father and daughter remembering that they had once loved each other without conditions. One afternoon, Henry took Mia to a park. She ran through the grass. He sat on a wooden bench and watched her. For the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about his reputation. He wasn't thinking about his career. He wasn't thinking about his next case. He was simply watching his granddaughter play. Mia suddenly ran back. "Grandpa!" She held something in her hand, a small gray stone. She placed it in his palm. "It's for you." Henry smiled. "What for?" "So you don't miss me when I'm gone." His smile disappeared. I could never forget you. Mia shrugged. Keep it anyway. Henry closed his fingers around the stone. It was ordinary, worthless to everyone else, but to him it became the most valuable thing he had ever owned. Not a trophy, not a plaque, not a legal award. A tiny stone given by a little girl who had somehow found her way through every wall he had built. Isabella eventually finished chemotherapy. Her surgery was successful. Her doctors were optimistic. She entered remission, and Henry made another decision. He retired, not because he hated the law, but because he finally understood that his life needed something more than a title. He wanted to be present. He wanted to witness. He wanted to show up. He moved closer to Isabella and Maya. He learned how to garden. He learned how to fish. He learned how to make pancakes shaped like animals. He learned how to ride a bicycle beside Mia without shouting instructions every 5 seconds. He became the grandfather who was always there, the one who attended school plays, the one who read bedtime stories, the one who showed up. Years later, Mia was 7. She sat at the kitchen table coloring a sea turtle. Suddenly she looked up. "Grandpa?" "Yes." "Do you remember when I called Mom from the big room?" Henry smiled. "I remember every second." "Why were you laughing?" Henry thought for a moment. "Because I thought I was the most important person in that room." Mia tilted her head, and then Henry smiled. "Then you reminded me that I wasn't." She returned to coloring. "I'm glad I called." Henry looked at her. "So am I. And so am I." He reached into his pocket. The grey stone was still there. He carried it every day. That evening, the family gathered for dinner. Elizabeth arrived first. Isabella came shortly after. Mia ran through the kitchen. The room filled with laughter. Nothing about the scene was extraordinary. No judge. No courtroom. No dramatic ruling. Just a family eating dinner together. And Henry realized something. This was his legacy. Not the cases he had won. Not the opinions he had written. Not the reputation he had spent 23 years protecting. This. His daughter sitting beside him. His granddaughter laughing at the table. His ex-wife smiling across the room. A home filled with people who actually wanted him there. That was the legacy he had almost lost. Later that night, Henry sat on the porch with Mia. The stars stretched across the Georgia sky. The swing moved slowly. Mia rested her head against his shoulder. "Grandpa?" "Yes." "Yes." "I love you." Henry closed his eyes. "I love you too." He reached into his pocket and felt the smooth grey stone. For years, he had believed justice meant knowing when to punish, when to rule, when to draw a line. But now he understood something different. Sometimes justice meant admitting you were wrong. Sometimes it meant stepping down. Sometimes it meant listening. And sometimes it meant holding a little girl's hand and realizing that the person you were trying to become was never as important as the people you had forgotten along the way. Henry had spent 23 years sitting above everyone else. But the most important moment of his life happened when he finally stepped down. He stepped down from the bench. He stepped down from his pride. He stepped down from his excuses. And he became a father again. A grandfather. A human being. The judge who once believed he could control every outcome finally understood the one truth no courtroom could teach him. Ask. You can win every case in the world and still lose your life if you forget who is waiting for you at home. And sometimes, the person who saves you isn't a lawyer, isn't a judge, isn't a doctor. Sometimes it's just a little girl in a pink dress, holding a stolen phone and saying 4 words that change everything. Whoever I want,